Hey guys, welcome back. We are going to be discussing probably my favorite unit of the semester, anatomy and physiology. Those of you that have taken and or will be taking the complete anatomy and physiology of the speech and hearing mechanism course with me know that this is a favorite topic of mine. If you've taken that course, this will be somewhat of a review for you. We will be highlighting different things. If you have not taken that course and plan to take that course, this will be a nice introduction for you and will help you out later on when you do get to the complete course. So, let's begin. Take a look up here. This is our ear, okay? This will be getting us through, or this picture can really get us through the pretty much the entire unit, okay? So let's take a look. There are some different things that are labeled, okay? You probably should be aware of those structures that are labeled, and if you are not yet, based on the reading, start to become familiar with them. The ear is first broken down into three major areas, okay? They're labeled here at the bottom. We have our external ear, which goes from distal, outside, or farthest from the center of the body, to the middle ear, to the inner ear, which is the medial most point. When we're talking about anatomy, we go from distal to medial. We go from farthest away from the center of the body to closest to the center of the body. Some people get confused between external, middle and inner ear, I should say. External is pretty clear, that's the outermost portion, but some people think the middle of the ear is the middle of the body. It's not. We go from external to middle to inner, okay? Middle is in the innermost portion of the ear as we break it down in this way. All right, excuse me. So let's work our way inward. First, we'll just discuss some of the major anatomy points of the ear, then we'll break it down a little bit more specifically, and then we'll get into how the anatomy works, so the physiology, right? So looking at the external ear, the part that is labeled A here, okay, that's the part that we often think of as the ear. That's the part you can touch, that's the part that you pierce. That is known as the pinna, or the auricle, with an AU. So that's the pinna, okay, that's the part that has the lobe. For the purposes of this course, we're just going to leave it at that. The different parts of the pinna have different names, but we're not going to discuss that for this course. If we get into anatomy and physiology of the speech and hearing mechanism, we're going to get into it a little bit further. But right now, we'll talk about the pinna, okay, which has an opening in it, okay? That opening leads to a long canal. Okay, that is known as the external auditory meatus, and that is labeled here as K. The external auditory meatus, or the ear canal, okay, is the entranceway to the middle ear. It's a long canal, okay, that is housed at the outer third by cartilage, okay. Along the walls, there's cartilage surrounding the ear canal, or the external auditory meatus, and then the inner 2/3 is surrounded by bone, okay? It's got osseous surrounding the canal, osseous meaning bony. Okay, so there's cartilage on the outside, bone on the inside, okay? And, excuse me, in adults, it's somewhat straight. There is a slight curvature to it. In children, there's more of a curve, okay? So that's important to note. Actually, vice versa. Did I just say adults versus children? The other way around, okay? Take note of that. The outer third that is surrounded by cartilage also has a lot of mucous membrane in the tissue of it, so that's where we have earwax that is built up in this area. We have hair cells that are in this area. We'll talk more about that in a little bit, but that's an important note. Okay, so the external auditory meatus, or the ear canal, leads down to this barrier to the middle ear. This barrier has 3 layers. This barrier, do you guys know what that is? What J is? The tympanic membrane, or commonly known as the eardrum. The tympanic membrane has 3 layers, okay? From outside to inside, okay? The outer layer is contiguous with the surroundings of the external auditory meatus. It's made up of the same material, okay? So that outer layer is often thought of as part of the external ear, whereas the inner 2 layers, the middle layer and the inner layer, are often thought of as part of the middle ear, okay? The inner 2 layers, the middle layer is fibrous in nature, so it kind of gives the eardrum or the tympanic membrane somewhat of a structure, okay? And then the inner layer is contiguous with the material that surrounds the rest of the middle ear. Okay, so the tympanic membrane, or that label J here, is the barrier between the external and middle ear. It is shaped kind of like a bowl. It's a little bit concave, okay, towards the inside. But it is connected to, on the inside, kind of at the center, to B. Anyone know what B is? B is the first of the ossicles. The ossicles are 3 tiny little bones located in the middle ear. From distal to medial, we have the malleus, the incus, and the stapes, or the stapes, depending on how you want to say it. The malleus, the incus, and the stapes are the 3 ossicles. The malleus is connected to the tympanic membrane. Then the incus is in the middle, connected to the malleus and the stapes. And the stapes is connected to a structure of the inner ear, and it's connected at a location called the oval window. We'll get to that in a minute. So the middle ear has the 3 ossicles. It also houses G, if you look over here, this long tube, okay? That is the eustachian tube, named after Mr. Eustachian. So it's a capital E when you write it, okay? The eustachian tube is a pressure equalizing tube. It allows for an opening from the middle ear all the way into your pharynx, so that's the back of the nose and throat, okay? Did you ever have an issue with pressure in your ears? You might want to pop your ears. You think there's pressure if you go on an airplane or you're chewing gum. If you pop your ears, what you're actually doing is you're equalizing the pressure between the atmosphere or the air around you and the pressure in the middle ear. Okay? That eustachian tube provides an opening into the world. So if there's an infection or if that eustachian tube is inflamed, okay, oftentimes you get a decrease in pressure in that middle ear, and you feel like you have to pop your ears to increase the pressure in the ear. Have to be careful when you do that, because if you notice, the tympanic membrane right there, if you pop your ear, if you blow air into the middle ear, if you make high pressure in the middle ear, you're blowing out the tympanic membrane to a certain extent. So you don't want to do that too hard, because you might pop your eardrum, and you don't want to do that. But that's for another discussion at another time. Okay, so those are the major structures of the middle ear that are shown here. The middle ear also houses 2 of the tiniest muscles of the body, the tensor tympani and the stapedius. Those are both located in the middle ear, and we'll talk a little bit about what they do in a minute. But yeah, the tensor tympani is attached to the malleus, and the stapedius muscle is attached to the stapes. Okay, so in addition to the ossicles in the middle ear and the eustachian tube, the other anatomical structure that's important are the 2 muscles of the middle ear, known as the stapedius and the tensor tympani. Okay. Then we get into the inner ear. Like I said, usually the barrier for the inner ear is the oval window, which is what the stapes is connected to. If you look, the stapes is connected to this large portion of this big structure here. Looks big, but it's actually pretty small in your body. The whole structure, okay, including this coiled part down here, this large middle section here, and these 3 rings over here, that entire structure is known as the bony labyrinth. The bony labyrinth, okay, the entire inner ear is housed in this bony labyrinth, okay? Starting at the middle, the center large portion of the bony labyrinth, it's kind of labeled E over here, is known as the vestibule. Think of the vestibule as an entry point, right? So the vestibule to the inner ear, or the bony labyrinth, is right here. The vestibule also houses the oval window, okay, which is attached to the stapes. If we hook a left from the vestibule over here in this picture, hook a left and kind of up, we get into the vestibular portion of the ear. You guys familiar with what that is? The ear not only houses hearing, the hearing system, it also houses the vestibular system. The vestibular system is the system of our body that allows us to know where we are in space. So it helps with proprioception, it helps with knowing where you are in relation to the world. So if you get dizzy, that's your vestibular system. Those of you that have or have heard of vertigo, that's your vestibular system. The vestibular system in this picture, again, comes off of the vestibule of the bony labyrinth. It is encased in bone, as I said before, and these 3 rings are part of the vestibular system. Those are your semicircular canals. Your semicircular canals, labeled D in this picture. Okay? We're going to get to that at the very end of the anatomy unit. We'll talk a little bit more about the vestibular system. But for now, let's hook a right, or go down, kind of from the vestibule right now. If we come down here, we have this coiled part of the bony labyrinth, here labeled H. That coiled section is what houses your organ of hearing. Okay, and that is the, anyone? Cochlea. Okay, this coiled section is your cochlea. The cochlea is your hearing organ. Really, if you don't have a cochlea, then you do not have hearing. Okay, individuals that are deaf or that are profoundly deaf, that are deaf from birth, often have issues with the cochlea. We'll get more specific about that a little bit later. The cochlea is connected to the auditory portion of the 8th nerve. The 8th nerve is your auditory nerve, also known as the vestibulocochlear nerve. Okay? I don't know if you guys are familiar with the 12 cranial nerves. There are 12 nerves that come from the brain that deal with the majority of the sensory and motor aspects of our body. The 8th nerve, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8th nerve, is known as the vestibulocochlear nerve. That's the nerve that comes into the ear. Here it's labeled as F, okay? F, or the 8th nerve, has 2 portions. One goes directly to the cochlea, and that's the cochlear portion of the 8th nerve, or the auditory nerve. And then the other portion of the 8th nerve goes towards the semicircular canals, and that's the vestibular portion of the 8th nerve, or the vestibulocochlear nerve. Okay? Running right alongside the 8th nerve is the 7th nerve, which here is labeled L. And if you notice, it's cut off here, okay, because it kind of follows through and past the ear and provides a lot of input to other portions of the body. We're not going to worry about that. We only want to know that the 7th nerve runs alongside the 8th nerve, because if we have surgery, or inner ear surgery, we have to be careful of not touching or nicking that seventh nerve, because then we could run into issues with paralysis of other parts of the body and the face, and we don't want to do that. So L is the seventh nerve, which runs right alongside F, which is the eighth nerve, which is the vestibular cochlear nerve. It has two portions. It breaks off into the cochlear portion, or the auditory nerve, and the vestibular portion, known as the organ of balance, if you will. Okay? Okay. The eighth nerve runs all the way up to the brain. Okay? And it runs up to the portion of the brain known as Heschel's gyrus. Heschel's gyrus is the portion of the brain that the eighth nerve comes into contact with, also known as the primary auditory cortex. Okay, the cortex of your brain, the outer lining of the whole brain, does a whole bunch of different things. It takes care of a lot of parts of what you do as a human, and one of those things is audition or hearing. And the part of that cortex that receives information from the ear is known as the primary auditory cortex, or Heschel's gyrus, okay? And the eighth nerve is what takes all this information of hearing up to the brain. All right? So that's kind of central in terms of auditory, the central function, meaning the brain, as opposed to the peripheral portion, meaning the ear. So this is peripheral hearing, and once we get up to the eighth nerve going to the primary auditory cortex, we get into the central portion of hearing. Okay? You can take a look at a video. I believe it's on the next slide. Yeah. Click on this link and you will see a video which shows you an actual three-dimensional structure of the ear and breaks down the anatomy pieces that we just talked about. Okay? So take a look at that. It's very good, quick and dirty. It tells you everything. Okay? Now we're going to go through those different parts of the ear from outer to inner, breaking things down a little bit more in terms of the structures and talking a little bit about the physiology. Alright, so let's start with the outer ear. Again, the pinna or the auricle is the prominence that we know as the ear. Okay? It's mainly composed of cartilage. That's what gives it its structure. So cartilage is structural, but also not as hard as bone, so that's why we can move it a little bit. Okay? Its primary purpose is to collect and amplify sound. Okay? So the external ear in general, the pinna and the external auditory meatus, the primary function of the external ear is to collect and amplify sound, directing it towards the tympanic membrane. Well, how do we collect sound? Well, we use the pinna, and we use the different portions of the pinna. We use the ridges, and we use the valleys of the pinna to collect sound, okay? That's why it's large. Sound is collected, and then it's funneled into the external auditory meatus. When you bring something like sound, okay, like air particles that are bouncing back and forth, and you funnel them into a smaller area from a larger area, you are amplifying the movement that they have and the pressure that they have in that movement, so that increases the sound volume, or the intensity, if you will. That's a very quick and dirty breakdown of what's going on, but it hopefully makes it understandable for you guys at this point. So the ridges of the pinna actually allow us to collect sound from different areas. So our ears are not on the front of our head. Our ears are on the side of our head. But those ridges allow us to grab sound that's coming at us from all different angles. Okay? From down, from up, from front to side to back. The ridges allow the air particles that are moving, the sound waves, to bump into different parts of the pinna and then get directed into the external auditory meatus. So we collect sound, we funnel it into the external auditory meatus, thereby amplifying the sound. collecting and amplifying sound. And then a third function of the pinna in particular is something that we call localization. Localization is how we know where something is based on the way we hear it, okay? So if you hear an ambulance coming at you, right? Starts out loud and it gets, starts out soft and it gets louder as it gets close to you. But if that ambulance is on the right-hand side of us, coming at us from the right-hand side of us, we know to turn to the right because we are able to know where that ambulance is, localize that ambulance, even if we don't see it yet, based on the sounds that we hear. That is because the sounds enter our ears at different times. If the sound or the ambulance is coming from our right, I'm going to first hear the sound waves in my right ear before I hear them in my left ear. That slight timing difference, okay, the difference it takes from the sound to get from my right ear to my left ear allows my brain to transition that timing difference into a localization pinpoint, okay? So I hear it first in the right ear, then in the left ear, I know that it's coming from my right. If I hear it first in my left ear, then in my right ear, this is milliseconds difference, guys, sometimes. I know that the sound is coming from my left, okay? Localization, pinna. Collecting and amplifying sound, pinna, external auditory meatus. Okay, so the external ear, if we go back to that anatomy picture, the external ear really has three functions: to collect and amplify sound, and then to localize the sound. And then finally, the external auditory meatus has a third function. Okay, the ear canal, or the opening into the outer ear, am I on the right page? Yeah. Has a third function, and it's to provide protection. Here we go. The external auditory meatus, or the ear canal, provides protection for the rest of the ear, for the middle ear and the inner ear. How does it provide protection? Well, I kind of mentioned it before. The lining of the ear canal allows for the secretion of mucus, or cerumen. Okay? Foreign bodies, dust, tiny bugs can get caught in the cerumen or the earwax, okay? And they can't get any further, okay? Additionally, there are hairs, tiny little hairs in the ear canal that collect and block foreign bodies from getting further down the line, okay? It is also warm in there. It's a bit humid because of the cerumen and the hair cells. That actually allows for elasticity, or more movement of the tympanic membrane, because of that temperature difference and that humidity. Protection, okay, protection from foreign bodies, allowing the tympanic membrane to move. Cerumen should naturally make its way out of the ear, so if anything gets collected in the cerumen, like dust, tiny bugs, it should make its way out of the ear on its own, okay? One, because the ear, like I said before, is on a slight angle, okay? So it works its way out. Additionally, the skin cells of the lining of the external auditory meatus also migrate outward as they get older, okay? So there's some movement. You can't see it, it's very slow. But there is movement outward. So you do not have to help clean out the external auditory meatus typically. And if you do, and you use something like a Q-tip, what you're actually doing is you're shoving a Q-tip in this hole and you're pushing things further and further back. You're not necessarily getting them out. So don't use a Q-tip. If you need to clean your ear, use a tissue and a finger on the outside. But you shouldn't stick anything into the ear canal. It actually does not benefit you. You're just pushing things up against the tympanic membrane. So if you put a a cotton swab into the ear, you're actually pushing any cerumen in further, and it's going to lodge itself up against the tympanic membrane. if you lodge cerumen or earwax up against the tympanic membrane, it's going to build up on the tympanic membrane. And the tympanic membrane is meant to flow back and forth. It's meant to be elastic and move somewhat freely. If you add stuff to it, okay, it's not going to be able to move as freely as it wants to, and thus it's going to affect your hearing, okay? Not good. Don't do that. So don't use a cotton swab, and you'll be good to go. All right, let's continue. We're going to discuss just a few of the malformations of the outer ear of the external ear, atresia, or the absence of the absence of outer ear structures. So atresia is the absence of the pinna, typically, and the opening, the external auditory meatus. So oftentimes there's a closure. Okay, complete closure is not good because obviously then we can't do what we said the external ear is meant to do. We can't collect and amplify sound. We can't aim the sound towards the middle ear. We can't localize sound. Not good. A lot of times these malformations, including atresia, are unilateral in nature, so it may affect one ear and not the other. Sometimes it can be bilateral, okay? But atresia, or the absence of the opening for the external ear and or the pinna, often suggests that there's going to be malformations in the middle ear as well. So what's in the middle ear? The ossicles. So a lot of times if a person has an atresia, we also have to make sure that they do or don't have their ossicles as well. If they have ossicles, that's good. They can get hearing from different ways, and we'll talk about that later. If they don't have their ossicles, that makes hearing even more difficult. So that's atresia. Atresia, stenosis. Stenosis is a narrowing of, so it's a narrowing of the external auditory meatus, or the ear canal, which doesn't allow for proper amplification of sound. And then finally, aplasia and microtia. Aplasia refers to any type of tissue that's underdeveloped in the body. If it's specific to the auricle or the pinna, then we call it microtia, and that's usually a malformed or a unusually small pinna, okay? You can have aplasia or microtia of the pinna and still have an opening for the external auditory meatus. You can have a microtia or an aplasia of the pinna and have an atresia where you do not have the opening for the external meatus, or a stenosis. So you can have one or more of these different classifications depending on what's going on with the individual. How that happens, usually congenitally or in the womb, we are going to talk about later on in the semester when we talk about the different disorders of hearing. But that's just a little information for now before we get into the tympanic membrane. Again, the outer layer of the tympanic membrane is often thought of as part of the external ear, so that's why we'll talk about it now. And then the middle layer, the fibrous portion, and the inner layer are thought of as part of the middle ear. As I said before, the eardrum or the tympanic membrane is slightly concave. It's meant to vibrate. It is meant to move, okay? When air particles or air molecules bounce into it, it moves and thus allows for sound. We're going to get into how sound happens in the next unit, but the tympanic membrane is key to allowing us to hear, because sound waves are basically air molecules that are moving in the atmosphere or in the air around us, and as they get closer and closer to our ear, they're collected, they're amplified, they're pointed and directed toward the eardrum, they hit the eardrum, they bounce into the eardrum, and they transfer their energy from the air molecule to the eardrum, and the eardrum moves as a result. What's on the other side of the eardrum? You guys already know this, the malleus. So when that energy is transferred from the air particle to the tympanic membrane, setting the tympanic membrane into movement, it in turn takes that energy and moves it to the malleus, and the malleus moves. The malleus is connected to the incus is connected to the stapes. They all move. They take the energy and they move. The stapes is connected to the oval window. Okay? Once the energy, or the sound energy, touches the oval window, that's when a lot of things happen, and we'll talk about how that allows us to hear. But before we get to that, a couple of other structures in the middle ear that we want to highlight. We already talked about the two small muscles that are in the middle ear, the stapedius and the tensor tympani. Both of those are there for a reason. They actually allow for what's called the acoustic reflex. If sounds are too loud, they can cause damage to the ear. Okay? If sounds are too loud and low pitch, they cause more damage to the ear. What happens is that these two muscles actually contract when there's a loud sound. Not a quick loud sound that comes out of nowhere, but a loud sound that's happening over time. Excuse me. So if you hear like a gunshot quick, these muscles can't do what they're supposed to do in that fast amount of time. But if you're at a club and you're standing in front of a speaker and there's a loud bass beat that's happening consistently, these muscles will do what they need to do. What they do is they contract. When something contracts, it often tenses. When they contract, they pull on the stapes and the malleus. Remember, that's what they're connected to. By pulling on them, they tighten that ossicular chain, okay? The ossicular chain gets tight, okay? Something that's tight can't vibrate low frequency or low pitch sounds as well. It acts as a filter. It filters out the low pitch sounds. So only high pitch sounds can really get through. So those low pitch loud sounds are filtered out. So the bass beat of that speaker that could cause major damage to your inner ear is filtered out by the ossicular chain tightening as a result of the contraction of the stapedius muscle and the tensor tympani. Okay? So yeah, that's important to note. What else? I talked about the eustachian tube as an air pressure equalizer. It also allows for ventilation. So if there's fluid buildup in the middle ear, hold on, let me just make sure we're aware of that. Outer ear, air. Middle ear, air and bone. Inner ear, in the bony labyrinth, is fluid, okay? So there's should only be fluid in the inner ear. There should not be fluid in the middle ear. If fluid builds up in the middle ear, that fluid can be infected because it's in a closed-off environment that's often dark and hot and humid. Infection of the middle ear infection, you've probably heard of it. Not good. The eustachian tube actually allows for fluid in the middle ear to naturally drain out. That's a good thing. But as I said before, sometimes the eustachian tube can be inflamed, can be infected. Okay? Therefore, fluid in the middle ear cannot drain out. Not good. Middle ear infection, and therefore we have to create our own ventilation system. Oftentimes we'll perforate the eardrum and put a tube in there, myrigotomy tube, if you've ever heard of ear tubes. Kids often have that surgery. We allow for ventilation of the middle ear that way. But typically, the eustachian tube provides ventilation of the middle ear. That should be filled with air and not fluid. Okay. Let's see, did we hack everything? I think we did. Okay, we are up to our inner ear. Okay, let's get to it. There's a video up here that shows you a little bit and some high definition video with some animation, what we're going to be talking about now, so definitely watch that. It's helpful, it's really good. Take a look. Okay, so inner ear. We're going to start with the oval window. The oval window is on the other side of the stapes, okay? The oval window is an opening into the bony labyrinth. The entire inner ear is encased in bone. In that bone is fluid. That fluid is called perilymph fluid. So the fluid in the bony labyrinth, both the vestibular side and the auditory side, is called perilymph fluid. Yeah? Okay. What happens is, we were talking about sound before, and we were talking about sound energy. Remember, air particles moving, air particles move into the external auditory meatus, they bump into the tympanic membrane starts to move, the energy is transferred on the other side to the malleus, to the incus, to the stapes. So the stapes moves. Okay, the stapes moves, it pushes into the oval window. Well, if it's pushing into the oval window, it's going to be pushing on the fluid that's in that bony labyrinth, right? But if it's a closed system, if the bony labyrinth is closed and we're pushing into it, then there's going to be pressure. The pressure of that fluid that's being pushed into by the stapes of the oval window can burst open the bony labyrinth. You might get a crack, you might get a leak. We don't want that. So, there's a safety valve. There's the round window. The round window is just below the oval window, okay? The round window is an opening, it has a layer of like a film covering it. So it's an opening in the bony labyrinth that is covered by a filmy layer, okay, that basically kind of pushes out when the oval window gets pushed in. So the perilymph fluid gets pushed, but it has room to move out of the round window, okay? It doesn't burst through the filmy layer of the round window. It's strong enough to hold the fluid, okay? So picture if you have your car, right? And you open one window, okay? And you blow air into your car, well, it's gonna circulate, but if there's already too much air in the car, it needs to go out somewhere. So you have to open another window in order to do that, all right? Do you ever open the back windows of your car only as you're driving and you hear that flutter of sound? I'm not going to get into specifically what that is, but if you open another window, you don't hear that sound anymore. That's what's happening there. Similar thing. Okay, so bony labyrinth filled with perilymph fluid. When the stapes pushes into the oval window, that perilymph fluid gets moved around, and eventually it gets pushed out of the round window. Good? Good. But how does that help with sound? How does that affect sound? Well, the cochlea houses our organ of hearing, okay? So remember, we went into the bony labyrinth through the vestibule and we hooked a right and we went into the cochlea? Well, the bony labyrinth is a tube filled with perilymph fluid. The perilymph fluid moves all the way around the coils of the cochlea. Remember, it looks like a snail shell? Well, the perilymph fluid, the energy flows through the cochlea all the way up to the top. Then, it actually has a separate tube, there are two tubes working here, where the fluid and the energy from the fluid goes to the top, but it actually then comes back down the coils and out the round window. So energy moves in through the oval window, perilymph fluid in the tube goes all the way up to the apex, all the way up to the top of the cochlea, then it goes down another tube all the way to the bottom of the cochlea and out the round window. Yeah? So there are two tubes here. Tube that goes up, tube that comes down. Both of those tubes are filled with perilymph fluid. Okay, what are those tubes called? The tube that goes up is the scala vestibuli. The tube that goes down is the scala tympani. Okay? Up, perilymph fluid flows through the scala vestibuli, goes up to the apex of the cochlea. Down, the perilymph fluid takes the energy through the scala tympani out the round window. Okay? Two tubes running alongside each other. Well, if there are two tubes running alongside each other, there's got to be something in the middle. There's actually another tube in the middle. Okay? That tube in the middle is called the scala media, middle. Easy enough to remember. Okay? Also known as the cochlear duct. Just another name for the scala media. The scala media, or the cochlear duct, is different than the scala vestibuli and the scala tympani because it is filled with a different kind of fluid. The fluid in the scala media is known as endolymph fluid. Okay? Perilymph fluid in the scala vestibuli and the tympani, tube that goes up, tube that comes down. In the middle, the scala media is filled with endolymph fluid. Okay? Alright, now, we're going to cut into those tubes. We're going to take a cross section of those tubes. So if I cut into those tubes, I have this picture. Up top is a portion of the scala vestibuli. It's filled with perilymph. Down on the bottom is a portion of the scala tympani. It's filled with perilymph fluid. Okay? So, energy from the stapes gets pushed into the oval window. Okay? The fluid, or the perilymph fluid, in the scala vestibuli takes that energy. It travels through this tube all the way up to the top of the cochlea, the apex of the cochlea. Okay? Then the energy is transferred to the perilymph fluid in the scala tympani, which travels all the way down to the base of the cochlea, and that energy then gets displaced out the round window. Okay? Now, as the fluid is moving through these two canals, okay, it's vibrating the walls of the canals. Okay? The walls of those canals are also the walls of the scala media. Okay? So as the fluid travels up the cochlea in the scala vestibuli, it's vibrating the top wall of the scala media. That top wall of the scala media, or the cochlear duct, is known as Reissner's membrane. Reissner is named after Mr. Reissner, so it's a capital R. Reissner's membrane. Okay? So the energy in the scala vestibuli, the perilymph fluid that's vibrating the Reissner's membrane, will also vibrate the endolymph and the scala media as it goes up. Then the energy travels down the scala tympani, the perilymph fluid. Okay? As the perilymph fluid in the scala tympani moves, it's vibrating the bottom wall of the scala media, or the cochlear duct. That bottom wall is known as Basler's membrane. Not named after Mr. Basler, no capital B. Basler's membrane. Okay? So as that vibrates, it vibrates the endolymph in the scala media. Why is that important? Well, located in the scala media, or the cochlear duct, is the organ of hearing. Okay? This is our organ of hearing. It's called the organ of Corti. The organ of Corti is sitting on the basilar membrane. It's sitting on the base of the cochlear duct. Okay? That's your organ of Corti, sitting on the base. Sorry. Okay? Located on top of the organ of Corti, this green thing that looks like a tongue here, is a flap known as tectorial membrane. The tectorial membrane is a flap that's sitting on top of the organ of Corti. So as the fluid in the scala media, or the endolymph fluid, moves as a result of the perilymph fluid moving the Reissner's membrane, or the perilymph fluid in the tympani moving the basilar membrane, it's going to move the organ of Corti, and it's going to move the tectorial membrane, okay, that's sitting on top of it. Well, why is that important, that movement? If you notice, these yellow things that are inside the organ of Corti are actually villi, or hair cells. Okay? There are hair cells, outer and inner hair cells. We're not going to get into the differences. Outer and inner hair cells that are located on the organ of Corti. The tops of the hair cells are touching the tectorial membrane. As the tectorial membrane moves and the organ of Corti moves, well, that movement is going to bend the tops of the hair cells. That bending or shearing of the tops of the hair cells actually create an electrochemical reaction because the hair cells are connected to what? Anyone? The eighth nerve. Yep. The movement of the hair cells creates a reaction that sends an electrical impulse through and up the eighth nerve all the way to the brain. And that is how we hear sound. And that is why the organ of Corti is known as the organ of sound. Does that make any sense? I hope so. The video will describe what I just talked about and give you some animation as well. Hopefully you understand that. After doing the reading, hopefully you understand that as well. Okay? Now, we're going to talk briefly about the inner ear. There's a video again at the top that'll show you some information about the inner ear. What you see here is the membranous labyrinth. The membranous labyrinth are the canals within the bony labyrinth. Okay, so if you remember, the bony labyrinth in the middle was the vestibule. Okay, the vestibule has all of this hiding underneath it or within it. These membranes or these canals are hiding in the vestibule. Okay, and then we have membranous semicircular canals within the bony semicircular canals of the bony labyrinth. So there are bony canals. Within the bony canals are the membranous canals. So it's a tube within a tube. Membranous tube within a bony tube. Okay? In the bony tube is perilymph fluid. Membranous tube is floating within the perilymph fluid. And then in the membranous tube is endolymph fluid. So, here we go. Bony tubes filled with perilymph fluid. Membranous tubes, remember these walls can vibrate, filled with endolymph fluid. Same thing is happening in the vestibular side of the inner ear. We have bony labyrinth, the vestibule, the semicircular canals. If we remove that bony labyrinth, within the perilymph fluid of the bony labyrinth is the membranous semicircular canals. Okay, and underneath the vestibule, that bulbous portion of the bony canal, are the saccule, the utricle, and the ampullas of the semicircular canals. We're not going to get too much into that, but the ampullas house the organ of balance, or the vestibular organ, okay? So remember how the hair cells in the organ of Corti allow for hearing? Well, similar things happen within the ampullas, or the bulbous portions of the semicircular canals. Semicircular canals come to an end where they meet the utricle, and where they meet, there's these bulbous sections on each of them. Those are known as the ampullas, and that's where we get information regarding vestibular information. And those ampullas and that utricle is attached to the vestibular portion of the eighth nerve. Okay? Just like the hair cells of the organ of Corti are attached to the cochlear portion of the eighth nerve. Make sense? Okay. The semicircular canals, there are 3 sets of them on each side. There's a horizontal set, a posterior set, and an anterior set. The horizontal set, okay, here, also known as lateral, give us information about our body when it's spinning around, okay? So picture the fluid in that horizontal canal moving as I spin around. Vestibular, balance. Posterior semicircular canal, also known as the inferior one, posterior meaning towards the back, inferior meaning it hooks down below. The posterior semicircular canal gives us information about shoulder to shoulder movement, so when our body is moving this way. So picture the fluid in that posterior semicircular canal moving back and forth as I move my head from shoulder to shoulder. And then finally the anterior, meaning more forward, and superior, meaning it goes up. The anterior semicircular canal gives us information regarding nodding, back and forth, nodding yes. Okay, so picture the fluid in that semicircular canal moving as I nod my head yes, front, back, front, back, front, back. As I do that, it's moving, it's getting information from the ampulla of the fluid movement, sending that to the brain for balance. It's a very underestimated version of what's going on, but it gives you as much as you need to know, really. Yeah. Okay. 3 semicircular canals that are membranous, filled with endolymph fluid, that are within the perilymph fluid of the bony labyrinth of the semicircular canals. Okay? The anterior semicircular canal gives us information about the body moving like this. The posterior gives us information about the body moving like this. And the horizontal gives us information about the body moving like this. That's all we're going to get into for this course regarding the vestibular system. Hope that makes sense. Now, we're going to finish up with some physiology of the ear, from external ear to inner ear, using this chart. This chart tells you everything you need to know about this unit. Okay? It gives you the picture that shows the anatomy, similar to the one that we started out the unit with. Okay? Breaks it down into the outer ear, the inner ear, and the middle ear. Okay? Outer or external ear, pinna, external auditory meatus, outer layer of the tympanic membrane. Middle ear, tympanic membrane, ossicles, eustachian tube, tensor tympani, and stapedius muscle. Inner ear, bony labyrinth, starting with the oval window in the vestibule, leading up to the vestibular system with the semicircular canals, which are tubes within tubes, membranous tubes filled with endolymph fluid, bony tubes filled with perilymph fluid. At the end of each semicircular canal is the ampulla, which houses the organ of the vestibular organ, which are connected to the vestibular nerve portion of the 8th nerve. If we travel from the vestibule into the hearing portion of the inner ear, we get to the cochlea. The cochlea is wide at the base. It moves itself all the way up to the top, or the apex. Within the bony labyrinths, within the bony tubes of the cochlea, we have a top one, the scala vestibuli, which brings energy all the way up to the top of the cochlea. And then we have the next bony tube, known as the scala tympani, which brings the energy down to the bottom of the cochlea and back out the round window of the bony labyrinth. Okay? In the middle of those two bony tubes that are filled with perilymph fluid is a membranous tube known as the scala media, or the cochlear duct, which is filled with endolymph fluid, which the energy from the movement of the perilymph on the top, connected to Reisner's membrane, the top portion of that middle duct, or the energy moving on the bottom from the scala tympani, moves the basilar membrane, or the bottom portion of the cochlear duct, okay? That movement of the top and bottom move the endolymph fluid within the cochlear duct, okay? The movement of the endolymph fluid moves the organ of Corti, which is sitting on the basilar membrane, which has hair cells that are attached or touched at the top to the tectorial membrane. When they move, they fire information to the nerves. The cochlear portion of the eighth nerve, which takes the information all the way up to the brain, or the central auditory system, okay? Going to the primary auditory cortex, also known as Heschel's gyrus, okay? That is all the anatomy, okay? We talked a little bit about the physiology of those different sections. We talked about how the outer ear provides protection with cerumen and hair cells. We talked about it providing amplification by collecting sound with the multiple ridges and funneling that sound into the ear canal, the sound going from a larger area to a smaller area, which increases the volume, increasing the intensity, amplification of sound as it gets to the tympanic membrane. And we talked about the outer ear helping us with localization of sound by sound coming into different ears or to the different ears at different times. Okay? Now, what we need to discuss is the function of the middle ear in terms of audition. Okay? And the function of the inner ear in terms of audition. How the middle ear and how the inner ear help us with hearing. Okay? That is the last thing that we need to discuss. That's what we're going to talk about. How we go from the outer ear to the brain, and how we transmit sound that comes from sound waves to electrical energy that the eighth nerve takes up to the brain. Okay? Let's look at the mode of operation to do that. Okay? The mode of operation of the outer ear you'll see listed as air vibration. The air particles move, okay? Air particles move. As they move, they get closer to the tympanic membrane. Once the air particles transfer the energy to the tympanic membrane, the mode of operation is mechanical vibration. That's the vibration of a solid. The solid in this case is the tympanic membrane. Okay, so we have the energy of the tympanic membrane, which transfers to the energy of the malleus, incus, and the stapes. So all of that is mechanical vibration because those are solids. Okay, the stapes pushes against the oval window, which pushes into the perilymph fluid. Okay, the perilymph fluid changes the mode of operation to hydrodynamic. Hydrodynamic meaning fluid energy. Okay. And eventually the perilymph fluid vibrates the endolymph fluid, which vibrates the hair cells on the organ of Corti, which in turn transfers the energy to the nerves. Okay? That's why we're changing from mechanical energy of the oval window to hydrodynamic energy of the fluid to electrochemical energy of the nerves. Okay? And then going up all the way to the brain. Nerves work as a result of different chemicals moving from one nerve to the other. We're not going to get into that, that's for anatomy and physiology, but that's the chemical portion of the electrochemical mode of transition. But how do we get from air movement to electrochemical movement? And how do we get the same sound that starts out as air movement or sound waves to nervous impulses? Well, that's actually what the middle ear is for. The middle ear is our transition from air to fluid. Okay? When we go from air to fluid, sound gets dampened. Sound gets attenuated. Have you ever tried to talk to a friend underwater while you're swimming? What happens? You can't hear them as well because air particles move pretty freely. Well, once the air particles move pretty freely and then hit fluid, okay, they start to go much slower. The sound is dampened, okay? Well, if we're changing from air to fluid, then every sound that we're going to hear is going to be dampened or softer. So are we going to tell the people around us to talk louder because our ears are going to dampen that sound and quiet it down? No. What we're going to do is we're actually going to use the middle ear to increase the intensity of the sound. Okay? That's why the middle ear is called an impedance matching system. Impedance matching system. So impedance is the term we're going to use for that attenuation of the sound, that decreasing of the intensity of the sound when it hits fluid. Okay? Impedance is the resistance to the flow of energy. The flow of energy is pretty bright and quick in air, in that gas. Okay? When it hits a fluid, it's going to come against resistance, impedance. Okay? So, what we do before we get to the fluid of the inner ear is we increase the energy. Okay? We increase it, therefore, when it hits that impedance, it's going to be reduced, but it's going to be reduced to where it started because we've increased it. So, airflow, we're going to increase that, and then it's going to reduce. That's what's happening from the outer ear to the middle ear to the inner ear. One of the ways we do it, we already talked about. We amplify the sound already at the level of the outer ear. The outer ear collects that sound and sends it from a larger area to a smaller area. Larger area pinna, smaller area tympanic membrane. Now, look at the difference in size from the tympanic membrane to the oval window. Tympanic membrane has a large diameter. Oval window has a small diameter. Okay? When you're sending something from a large area to a smaller area, it increases the pressure. Okay? When you're sending from a large tympanic membrane to a small oval window, we're increasing the pressure as long as we don't change anything. And the bony ossicles of the middle ear allow for that transition of energy. So we've increased the energy from the tympanic membrane to the oval window in the middle ear. Thus, when it hits the fluid, that it's going to burst through and not be attenuated. Okay? So that's why we call the middle ear an impedance matching system. Read through this in the text. Okay? If it's difficult to make sense of it, ask questions, throw me email questions, put up a discussion question. It probably will be helpful for all the students in the class. Okay? That's the main impedance matching portion of the middle ear. Okay? To increase the volume or intensity from the tympanic membrane to the oval window. So when the sound energy gets to the fluid of the inner ear, it's reduced, but it's reduced back to where it started. Because you came in like this, you increased it, and then you attenuated it, so it's still where it started. Okay? And then finally, we want to talk about the filtering distribution system of the inner ear. That is the function of the inner ear, to filter sound. What does that mean? Well, we already talked about the sound energy coming in the perilymph fluid, going up to the top of the cochlea, down the scala tympani. In the midst of that, it vibrated the endolymph of the scala media, moving the hair cells, and then we have sound. Well, how do we have different sounds? How do we know that it's a low sound versus a high sound? Different hair cells at different points along the organ of Corti as it travels up the cochlea, different hair cells fire or move based on different pitches or different frequencies of sound. I'm going to go back to this picture. Yeah. Okay. So as the sound energy comes in and travels up the scala vestibuli, if it's a low sound, okay, that low sound actually travels all the way up the scala vestibuli and does not vibrate the hair cells of the organ of Corti until it gets to the apex or the top of the cochlea. The hair cells at the top of the cochlea, at the apex, fire in relation to a low sound, a low frequency sound. Okay, low frequency sounds vibrate slowly. Okay, so the vibration of the perilymph fluid is slow. It goes all the way up to the apex, so the top of the cochlea, and then the hair cells fire. And the information goes up the auditory nerve to the brain, and we know it's a low sound. Now, high frequency sounds, or higher pitch sounds, vibrate faster. So, the vibrations of the perilymph fluid that travel up the cochlea actually stop at the lower end of the cochlea, at the base of the cochlea, and those hair cells fire. So high frequency sounds, vibrations move the hair cells at the base or the lower end of the cochlea, and low frequency sounds, slowly vibrating sounds, fire the hair cells at the apex of the cochlea. And that is a very simple version of how we hear low and high sounds, and how the inner ear acts as a filter. Okay, it filters out high sounds to the base of the cochlea and filters out low sounds at the apex of the cochlea. Okay, so the inner ear is a filtering system. Okay, the middle ear is an impedance matching system that allows for the increase of intensity of sound at the middle ear, so that when it hits the fluid of the inner ear, the impedance attenuates the sound. And the outer ear also helps in amplification of sound, but will protect as well and allow us for localization. So those are the functions of the external, middle, inner ears. All of this is described in the text, okay? And in the videos that are on the PowerPoints. If you have additional questions, please, again, post them in a discussion board or send me an email, and we will attempt to answer those questions. All right, I hope that all makes sense, and I will see you in the next unit where we talk about the nature of sound. So we'll talk a little bit more about how the air particles move and how it allows us to hear based on the anatomy of the ear. All right, thanks, guys.